This is a series on Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And the today's chapter that we're going to explore is called as the ladder of self-transcendence. This chapter is a part of the section on Jnana Yoga or Yoga of Integral Knowledge. And this section has 28 chapters. And this chapter is the 21st chapter, the Yoga of Self-transcendence. Over the course of the past 20 chapters, Sri Aurobindo starts by aligning the compass of sadhak with the seeking of Jnana Yoga, and then talking about the foundational elements, which is purification of understanding, concentration, the true meaning of renunciation. How does a sadhak go about withdrawing one's consciousness from the physical, the vital and mental, and seeking to transcend the material universe towards the divine. And then he completes the circle by re-embracing this universe with a more illumined consciousness. We start by seeing ourselves as physical and relating to others as friends, relatives or co-workers, to coming back and seeing everyone as the children of the divine and doing our work as the divine work. So he completes this whole circle and then elaborates and explores the ladder or the 7 layers of existence or planes of existence. Commonly, how we look at the universe is that there is a material universe and there is the spirit. So there is either spirit or matter. But actually, between the two, there are infinite layers of existence. And broadly, Sri Aurobindo classify those layers into 7 layers, starting from Sat, or the truth, as the absolute and the highest, to Chit, which is the dynamic consciousness of the divine, and then Ananda and the Vijnanamaya layer or the supramental as the top 4 layers, and then the lower 3 layers, which is the mind and the vital and the physical, which is more tangible and experiential for us, as the 7 layers of existence. Over the past few chapters, Sri Aurobindo has explored a deepening of understanding of these lower 3 layers, where our normal, usual existence plays out. In fact, it most plays out at the physical plane, and what we refer to our own vital and mental is actually the physical vital and mental. So the vital or the prana housed in the physical body and the mind housed in the physical frame. So usually, even in these 7 layers, although the 3 layers are accessible to us, most of our life is panning out at the 7th layer, which is the physical and the physical vital and physical mental. The spirit, the Satchidananda principle, is housed or poised at each of these layers, and it has very different capacities at each of these layers. At a physical, there is a different capacity. At vital and mental, a different capacity. Even how we experience God, or whatever we refer to as divine, is experienced differently at each of these levels. If we look at it with an example, and nothing better than the current context of India-Pakistan situation, if we feel as this being which is identified with the physical and is housed in this limited physical frame, we can do very little in this situation. We can contribute in small ways. At best, we can hope for a meaningful answer to the situation. At best, we can have compassion for everyone. At best, we can love, hope, and have faith. So this is how the being identified with the physical, with its limitations, can at best experience the current context of India-Pakistan. If the being is poised in the vital, and now the energy expands and one is no more feeling limited by the physical, then one can actually become into a satellite of the divine energy. Just like we have satellites operating around the earth which are relaying information, we can also become into satellites of the divine will and be the relayer of the infinite energy of the divine, and one can influence the world events. One can contribute positively, meaningfully to the situation, and not just feel like a victim of the situation. But just like in the first layer, when one is identified with the physical, and one is prone on one side to feel the hope, faith, and love and compassion, one is prone to feeling like a victim or feeling like an aggressor. At the vital level, one is prone to feeling like the doer, that I'm not the satellite, this power belongs to me. I'm the one who is influencing the world events. And that brings in that Titan or Rakshasa like consciousness within the being. The third possibility is of the being poised in the mental sphere, where the intellect is illumined. And as the intellect is illumined, it has the capacity to see clearly and understand the intentions of different forces at work in the given situation. And then it can sit above them with a calm indifference and influence and contribute to the situation through new meaningful solutions. And by creating newer thought forms, newer emotions, and newer possibilities in this situation. But to this calm indifference, wherein one is seated above, usually the vital and the physical revolts, because there is a part of us which doesn't just want to be looking from above, which wants to feel the suffering of others, which wants to be the healer, which wants to be the warrior. And hence, as our experience plays out at either of these levels, mental, vital, or physical, it doesn't bring in that contentment that we are seeking. Even though the intellect is illumined, but still one thing which is common to all three, Sri Aurobindo refers to the mental, vital and physical as the lower hemisphere and the top 4 layers as the higher hemisphere. So one thing common to the whole of lower hemisphere is everything has a name and a form. Hence a separation, be it at a physical level where everything from a plant to an animal to a human being to a piece of sand, everything has a name and a form. To the vital, where now the forms become more fluid and energetic, but still they have a name and a form. And even at the mental level, the thoughts and the mental constructs are also, so to say, separate from each other. They are also thought forms. So this separation exists at every level in the lower hemisphere. But if the sadhak turns inwards and upwards, there is a possibility for us to experience our essence, who we truly are. Not this physical, not this vital, not this mental, but who we truly are. And there one can experience that oneness beyond the name and form. And that realization can eventually reach a point where one can also feel that oneness, that infinite oneness within each other. And then from that point, one can also re-embrace the name and form. Again, it is not about then rejecting the world of name and form and just embracing the infinite oneness. What integral yoga aspires for is, it's like walking a rope, carrying that balance of seeing the world as it is in its name and forms as well, yet carrying within us that sense of infinite oneness as an essence within everyone. And this chapter, which helps us elaborate more on the experience of name and form, helps us understand better how things pan out in these hemispheres. What are the different capacities that divine or the spirit poised at different layers has? And it may not help us transcend these 3 layers, but it helps motivate and fuel the aspiration towards the higher layers. It also helps us clear the illusions. Very often, in fact, all of us sitting here have had some experience of divine touch which fuels or motivates us to come here or be a seeker. But it shares with us that how the perception of the divine changes at various levels of sadhana, and one doesn't need to get stuck at one level. One needs to see them as transient milestones and eventually seek the highest and the eternal. So Sri Aurobindo, over the course of these chapters, goes in more and more depth on the lower 3 layers of the lower hemisphere. In the physical, as the spirit gets poised in the physical, in the matter, and one feels identified with this physical body, the consciousness of our being gets narrow and exteriorized. When we are talking about infinite oneness, the consciousness is inward and expanded. And when we are identified with the physical frame, it becomes narrow and exteriorized. And it is then not fully exposed to the light of the spirit. At best, there are glimpses of the spirit. And one becomes like a frog in a well. One feels obliged to accept the physical matter universe as the true Brahman or the universe. And here Sri Aurobindo quotes the Taittiriya Upanishad, and he talks about how Bhrigu, the son of Varuna, is made curious by his father about the Brahman, by sharing that Brahman is the one which, when known, everything else is known. And he becomes curious, and he asks his father, how can I know the Brahman? And he says, go and concentrate. And he concentrates and comes back and says that, Father, I found the Brahman, and Brahman is food. Everything, food referring to matter, so to say. Everything starts from food, everything is sustained by food, and eventually everybody dies and merges back into matter or food. So the food is the Brahman. And this is the kind of conclusion one can draw about the divine or the infinite when one is identified with the material frame. The experience of divine is still as infinite. This material universe is also infinite, but it is more as a incongruent infinite. That the infinite is not a conscious force, it's like a mechanical inert force, and the universe is playing out inertly into its evolution. But the man has a capacity to evolve, and there is a fire of self-development in him. So even when he identifies with the physical, the mind has a capacity to detach from this body and experiences the glimpses of the spirit. Just like the frog in the well can have some glimpses of the light, so the mind can experience some glimpses of a world beyond. But when that happens and one sees this more conscious element in the divine, usually it triggers that common conflict that human beings go through, or a sadhak goes through, that the divine is beyond this matter, and if the divine has to be experienced, then one needs to leave this body, leave any attachments to this body, and merge with the divine and seek nirvana, or go beyond the cycle of birth and death. And even if one has to live in this physical frame now, it has to be barely limited to absolute necessities. So this is the kind of the solution that a man identified, a being identified with the physical comes to, that either the spirit is some incongruent infinite, an inert force, or it is in its highest possibility, a force of peace, infinite peace, a quietistic self which is passive. And this Sri Aurobindo describes through these lines that by this self-development there may come indeed some divine dynamic manifestation in him, but it cannot rise entirely above the heavy limitations of physical nature. The peace of the silent and passive self is more easily attained, and he can more easily and fully hold it. Too difficult for him is bliss of an infinite activity, the dynamis of an immeasurable power. So in the Annamaya Kosha, or in the physical Annamaya Purusha, or the being identified with the matter, the passive self, silent self can be more easily attained. It is difficult for it to hold the consciousness of the bliss of infinite activity or dynamis. Aurobindo describes the same narrative in Savitri through the chapter on the triple soul forces, which is in book 7, canto 4, and again the same message but expressed beautifully through poetry. He says that, and this is referring to the, out of the triple soul forces, the first of the soul force seated in the physical. O Savitri, I am thy secret soul. To share the suffering of the world I came. I draw my children's pangs in my breast. So here the spirit poised in the physical shares its purpose. I've come into this world to share the suffering of this world as a sacrifice. I draw my children's pangs. And then in the subsequent lines, it talks about, I have brought no arm of strength to aid or slay. God gave me love, He gave me not His force. So, through these lines, Sri Aurobindo shares the purpose of the spirit, and the limitations of the spirit poised in the physical, that it can bring love, it can bring compassion, but it is not brought its force or power to slay. And this is where Varuna, the father of Bhrigu, sends his son back to concentrate again and see if there is more to Brahman. And he comes back with the answer that, Father, now I found the Brahman, and Brahman is prana, or the vital force, because everything seems to emerge from this vital force of prana and is sustained by this prana and eventually merges back into energy or prana. So the prana must be the Brahman, and this is where a different experience happens to the being when it is poised in the vital being, in the vital sphere, and the being becomes the pranamaya purusha, seated in a pranamaya kosha in this universal prana. And here the ruling principle is the element of desire. And with this element of desire, and this heightened perceptions and capacities of being an energetic infinite being, it has the capacity to influence both the mind and the physical. And to the degree it can identify and withdraw oneself into this pranamaya purusha and kosha, to that proportion he becomes into a rajasic man. If you open Google or YouTube these days, then there are all kinds of courses, how to become a billionaire in this many days, or how to achieve what you want to, how do you succeed in life. All these different courses, especially coming from the West and now a lot from India, they're serving a beautiful purpose of uplifting the humanity, but at the same time they are opening up human beings to this vital possibility of becoming into a rajasic man, without many a times offering the understanding and awareness of a supra-vital possibility from where this vital can be purified to its true intentions. And in process, what happens is that it turns the man into a rajasic man, which is doing all this largely for the purpose of its own personal satisfaction. And even if it seeks the God's energies, it prays to the Durga, it prays to the Kali, it prays to the Lakshmi, it is meant to acquire certain energies for its own personal satisfaction and purpose. And even if the mind, so this is more of like a Rakshasa consciousness again, where one is using everything for one's own purpose. But even if the person develops more self-control and develops the mind and the intellect with the vital and comes across as a more harmonious and intellectual and even an altruistic person, it is still meant for the sake of this personal satisfaction, and that again doesn't bring in the true fulfillment or the purpose of this. Again, Savitri, in Savitri, Sri Aurobindo describes this higher possibility of the divine, or how the spirit is poised in the vital sphere as, so the spirit says that in the vital sphere that I am Durga, goddess of the proud and strong, and Lakshmi, queen of the fair and fortunate. I wear the face of Kali when I kill, I trample the corpses of the demon hordes. So here the divine manifests itself in its dynamic form, the Durga, the Kali and the Lakshmi, and it has the capacity to illumine the person, illumine the human beings. But the limitation that emerges at this sphere, Sri Aurobindo expresses in subsequent lines. But the great obstinate world resists my word, and the crookedness and evil in man's heart is stronger than reason, profounder than pit. And the malignancy of hostile powers puts craftily back the clock of destiny, and mightier seems than the eternal will. So, because at the vital level, the desire is the reigning principle, what happens is that the world resists these forces. The world, in a way, turns against these forces, and the evil in man's heart becomes stronger than his own reason. And then he says, the cosmic evil is too deep to unroot. The cosmic suffering is too vast to heal. Even though the Durga and the Kali and the Lakshmi comes with the capacity of healing and uprooting the evil, but it comes across as too deep and too vast. A few I guide who pass me towards the light. A few I save, the mass falls back unsaved. A few I help, the many strive and fall. So in this vital world, there are a few who will be sincere and who will give oneself fully to this aspect of the spirit, and those the spirit is able to save, but they are few. And that is the limitation at the vital sphere, and that is also the conflict at the vital sphere, because again, if one has to give oneself fully to this spirit, then one needs to withdraw oneself from the vital. Because even in sadhana, when we are fully identified with the vital, the sadhana is colored by desire. Okay, I should also get something out of it. it is not an entire self-giving, seeking just a communion with the divine. It gets colored with those desires. And so the sadhak has to withdraw oneself from the vital, even though the vital has more capacity than the physical to hold the dynamicity, but still has to withdraw from it. And then the same conflict emerges, because that can happen only in a state of quietude. And when the work has to be done, it has to be done in a dynamic sphere. So the sadhak then has to eventually withdraw oneself from this world and engage in very few limited activities. And the same story plays out again. And hence Varuna, the father of Bhrigu, tells him once again that go back and concentrate again. There is more to the Brahman. And this time he comes back and says, Father, now I have found the Brahman, and the true Brahman is the mind, where everything in this universe emerges from the mind as thought forms, and thoughts being put into motion as emotions, which dynamize the prana, and then prana turns into physical, and that is sustained by the thought forms and the mind, and anything can be created by the mind and sustained by the mind, and then eventually everything dissolves back into the mind. So Brahman has to be the mind, and the being or the Manomaya Purusha here gets poised into Manomaya Kosha, into the mental plane. And the key principle at work at this plane is illumination and clarity. So at this plane, the mind is developed the capacity to be able to see things and penetrate things and see the intentions behind what is happening in this world. And it enjoys what Sri Aurobindo refers to as the mental soul lives in this mental or subtle body, which enjoys capacities of knowledge, perception, sympathy, interpenetration with other beings hardly imaginable by us, and a free, delicate and extensive mentalized sense faculty. So one develops this mental sense faculty. So there is this outer senses out of which we normally operate. So at this Manomaya Kosha level, there is an inward senses of its own. There is a common saying that common sense is not very common. But there is another saying that in important things in life, do not rely upon the common senses. So if you have to go to the table and pick up a glass and come back, sure, use your outward senses. But if you're going to do something important, do not just rely on your outward senses, because your outward senses will tell you that sun is going around earth, but it's the inward senses, the capacity to self-reflect, through which the illumination and clarity can come. So rely on those inward senses for anything important in life, and that can come from this mental being seated in the Manomaya Kosha. And this is where with this heightened capacity, this heightened perception, the mind, now it is possible for the man to awaken to the mental consciousness, become this mental being, and put on this mental nature and live not only in physical and vital sheaths, but in this mental body. If there were a sufficient completeness in this transformation, he would become capable of a life and a being at least half divine. Here Sri Aurobindo refers to this mental consciousness, not of that ordinary mental consciousness, but of higher rungs of mind, which are still within the reach of the human beings, the intuitive, illumined, and the overmind. And by creating a certain completeness of living there, many saints and many sadhaks have lived a life which is half divine. But here again, Varuna comes in and says to Bhrigu that even these heavens of the mind are just like the rays of the sun, and they eventually have to come back onto the physical and the vital plane, and they again turn into separate rays. So they are not the actual sun, they are the rays of the sun. They can express a part of the truth, but not the whole truth. They can be a representative of the truth, but they cannot be the true truth. And so the seeking has to go on, and you need to go back and concentrate. And this is again very beautifully expressed in Savitri by Savitri. And she says to her mental soul, that even if thou rain down intuition's rays, the mind of man will think earth's own gleam. So the mind is prone to see the intuition's rays falling upon it as its own earth's shine. His spirit by the spiritual ego sink. So when this illumination comes, it can very often bring in that spiritual ego, that I am the house of the spirit. Or his soul dream shut in sainthood's brilliant cell. So the soul dreams for the eternal, but that dream can be shut in the brilliant cell of a saint, an illumined intellect, beautiful, but then again it is bound in its own set of ideas, the way they're looking at, because it's probably capturing one or a few rays of the sun, and it becomes brilliant, but it is still leaving behind the soul's actual dream, which is to merge with the sun. Where only a bright shadow of God can come, his hunger for the eternal thou must nurse, and fill his yearning heart with heaven's fire, and bring down into his body and life. So the aspiration needs to continue, the hunger for the eternal thou needs to be nursed, it needs to be fueled, and the yearning in the heart for the heaven's fire, the fire of sacrifice, the fire of aspiration seated in the heart, and the divine consciousness needs to be brought down into the life and the body. So this becomes, the Savitri is not to be illusioned by the heavens of mind, and she seeks more than this. And this is where now Bhrigu comes back to his father and says that I have found the true Brahman, which is the Vijnanamaya Kosha, or the causal body, and then subsequently comes back and says, I have realized that the Brahman is Ananda, or bliss, because Ananda is the conscious foundation of Satchidananda, and no words can express this truth. To the mind, they can be explained, because the mind at times stands at the border of this. It can be explained through symbolism, but all the same, it is just a representation than the truth. But the true Brahman is in these higher layers. And as a sadhak, we all experience a certain deep connection with the divine. And it's important to acknowledge that this connection may be coming from the spirit poised in the physical, where we experience this love and compassion, or from the vital, where we experience this dynamization of the Durga energy, or in this mind and illumined intellect, or sometimes at the borders from where the true light or the bliss can be reflected. But still the journey needs to go on towards the eternal, and one seeks the divine in its eternal, intense, true dynamism, and the aspiration continues there. But here Sri Aurobindo at the same time reassures that even though these high layers seem inaccessible or very undeveloped in human beings, either almost nearly inaccessible or very crudely developed, but still within every particle of this universe, within any intention or action in this universe, the bliss and the supramental is intimately present, and it is the driving force of everything that is happening in this universe. And he closes this by saying that yet its governing presence in the lowest forms assures us, because of the unity of all existence, that there is a possibility of their awakening, or possibility even of their perfect manifestation here, in spite of every veil, in spite of all the mass of our apparent disabilities, in spite of the incapacity or unwillingness of the mind and life and the body. And what is possible? One must one day be, for that is the law of the omnipotent spirit. So he ends with, again, a faith and a hope that even though it's inaccessible, and even though it is present within every particle and within every action of this universe, there is a possibility of the two coming together. And if the possibility exists, one day it must be. So with that faith and hope, we end today's session. Thank you.